Good evening and welcome to the Guildhall Library. My name is Joan Ransley. I'm one of the Guild workshop organisers, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Peter Ross from the Guildhall Library this evening, and he is the principal librarian here, and he's going to talk to us about the magnificent collection of books on food that are held here in this library. So I hope you enjoyed this evening. With Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Guildhall Library. I know that this is probably at least the third visit by the Guild, and I think Jane's been on all three. Have you been on all three? Yeah. And I think Sue's been. So these ones, these two. So one was probably about 12 years ago. The first one I think we had. So welcome again to Guildhall Library. What we're going to do today is I'm going to just talk about the collections that we have here, and just show a few examples of what you might be able to extrapolate from a single item, just some ideas that I've fed to some journalists who then made articles out of them. So I'm far too lazy to write anything myself. I'm not very good at writing, so I'm perfectly happy to give you ideas and feed you ideas from the collection. So just ask me when we get a chance. So I will talk about the collection, how it came to be here, what it contains, some of the gems, and then we will go through into the other room where we've just laid out a selection of the material. It is a selection because we have 10,000 cookery books, basically, or books relating to food and wine, including cookery books. So let's just get started on some of the background to why the collections are here. So Guildhall Library was originally founded in the 1420s. So it was founded under the terms of the will of this man. This is Richard Whittington, Dick Whittington of pantomime fame, who was 4 times Lord Mayor of London. He was elected 3 times and appointed once. And he was basically the richest man in the country, and he had lent money to the king, and people was borrowing money off him. And when he died, he left no direct heirs, so left money to the City of London to do charitable things with. So one of those things was to found a hospital, and there's still a Whittington Hospital in London. Various money went to almshouses and went to his local parish church, which is St Margaret's in the City of London. And then the city decided to use some of the money, along with money left by another mercer, because Whittington was a Mercers Guild, to found a library to serve the College of Priests that was based at Guildhall. So this is in the 1420s, in the reign of Henry VI. And we have no images of that original library apart from this. We think this is probably it. So the bit that's been outlined in yellow, this is from a copy of the copperplate map of the middle of the 16th century. And we think that bit there is the library. This is Guildhall, and we're basically just there, where that building is now. This is the sort of Guildhall precinct, just here. This is St Lawrence Jewry Church, which is just on the corner. We know from a description of the library, produced by John Stowe, a great historian of London, in the 1590s, that it was a 2-storey building, so that's the second storey we can see sticking above the rooftops. And that the library itself was on the first floor and had 4 bays, so this is probably the library. We've no idea what the inside looked like, but John Stowe told us that it was a library with wooden shelves. It had wooden beams on the ceiling and a slate roof, and the books were changed to the shelves. And this is actually Hereford Cathedral Library. So we imagine the library looked something like this when it was first built. We just have one book now with a chain on it. It's not from the old library. We sometimes get it out just to show people what a chain book looks like. As you can see, they're chained to rods here, along the shelves, and you unlocked them at the end. This is a modern reconstruction of the Guildhall, and that's the library just there. There's the Guildhall, and we're just about there. We only have one book from the medieval library. I'll just briefly mention this. This is the book. This is the copy of the Old Testament, a metrical version of the Old Testament, produced by somebody called Peter de Riga. And we know it was in the old library because it has this inscription which basically says, "This is the property of Guildhall Library." We had to buy it back in 1926. It was sold at auction. The reason we had to buy it back is because in the 1550s, this man, the Duke of Somerset, who was running the country under Edward VI, who was a child king, richest man in the country who was doing what he liked without referring to the Privy Council or even to the king, he just built a virtual palace on the Strand, which is Somerset House, and he decided he wanted a library, and so he sent 3 carts to the City of London, and he took all our books away. The reason he took all our books away is because basically the dissolution of monasteries, it was a religious establishment, and he thought he could do what he liked because basically the religious houses couldn't own that sort of property. So he took all of our books away. We never got them back, apart from that one book that we had to buy back. So no library from then until the 1820s. So then the Corporation of London started a new library in the 1820s. No building was built for it, but it gradually became used by the public more and more. It was mostly for the uses of the officers. And then in the 1870s, this building was put up, designed by Horace Jones, who was the architect of Tower Bridge. This building still exists. It's on the opposite side of the Guildhall, and we refer to it as the Old Library. It's a very beautiful building on the inside. It's now used for receptions, wining and dining, which is what the city does best. This is what the inside looked like until about the 1970s, apart from wearing the top hats. And then in the 1970s, unfortunately, all the furniture was basically thrown away. Beautiful Gothic furniture. And this building was designed in the 60s and opened in 1974. And we moved all the material over here. It took 7 weeks to move everything over here on trolleys rather than just 3 carts sent around the street. Right, so that's a really mad history, rushed history of the library. So we've been here since 1974 on this site, and the library's been in existence in its present form for nearly 200 years. So how comes that in all that time we've mostly collected material to do with the history of London, that we have acquired what amounts to 10,000 books on wine and food, and it's the largest public collection in the country. And the answer is that we've acquired it without really trying. In the 1880s and 90s, we received a number of deposits from some individuals in London. And my colleague Val, who's sitting at the back there, has just recently done some research into these people. There was one man called Thomas Staples, who was proprietor of this, the Albion Tavern, which was just down the road in Aldersgate Street. He catered to the City of London, basically. Lots of livery companies went and wined and dined here, and he also catered to the Lord Mayor's feasts. And he appears to have collected a lot of ancient cookery books, basically. Cookery books dating back to the 16th, 17th and 18th century and the 19th century. And when he died, they were bequeathed to the library here, along with some collections by a man called Robert Miller, and from the Cook's Guild as well. We got a small library from them. One of the items that we received was a manuscript cookery book, and this is a page from it. It came from the Robert Miller bequest, I think that's right. And just to say that, I'm sure you know this, but in an age before printing, books were clearly written down, but right from the 16th and 17th century, which this dates from, people had family cookery books like we all have at home, where we write down our recipes, or you've inherited from your parents, your mother, or even your father. So this is an example of just that. This is one of our earliest manuscript cookery books. In fact, it is our earliest manuscript cookery book. This was owned by a family in Essex, and the hand at the top, the writing at the top, is done by the steward of the house, and then the lady of the house has added, she's corrected things down here. So this is her very beautiful italic handwriting. She was a Puritan woman who was well educated, and she wrote in this very fashionable way. He wrote in the secretary's hand at the top. And this is a little recipe that's in the book that was stuck in on a piece of paper, how to make pancakes, supplied by Lady Barrington, probably from the 1640s. And these marks here are stains from butter, actually, or some fat. You can see that just like paper now, you know, you're making a recipe, you get stains on it. So this is a recipe for making a rather large amount of pancakes, because it says take 3 pints of milk. And that's typical of all recipes up until the 19th century. They always start with take a goose, take 3 pints of milk, etc. When my colleague Val was doing some research, we thought, until she'd done some research, we thought that this was the oldest cookery book that we had in the collection. And we only recently discovered this was in the collection because when those books were donated in the 19th century, we didn't keep them as a discrete collection on the shelves. We distributed them amongst other collections, and so they went where we thought they should go, rather than being retained as the Robert Miller collection. They got distributed. So over the 100 or so years, people forgot that this was probably our earliest cookery book, and it was just sitting on the shelves unrecognised. In its original cover, so this is an original cover from 1589, so we thought this was our earliest cookery book. It's an Italian cookery book on how to order banquets. It's somebody who worked for the family d'Este. and it gives instructions for banquets. And another book that came at the same time was this one, which again we only discovered very recently amongst our something like 200,000 titles of other books we've got. This was a book, another Italian book, giving carving instructions, and this was one of the ones that I could show you because some of them are quite grim, where they're carving up whole animals. And it also contains rather entertaining instructions for folding napkins. And as you can see, the instructions are down here, and you end up with that. So now because he wanted obviously to keep it basically secret, he only gave you a few instructions and then you had to extrapolate to create these wonderful things. So this again, this is 16th century, I can't remember what, 17th century. We've got both of those on display here, so you can have a look at those. Just to go back, and then today, when we were looking for books to get out to show you, I asked Val to do a search on our catalogue. You can do a search on our catalogue, which I'll show you how to do if you're interested in doing. You can search by the classification. So if you go to most libraries, 641 is where you find most cookery books on a public library system. So if you do a search on our catalogue, you can do search by 641, and you can limit your search to a certain century. So I asked Val to limit it to a certain century. And she came up with an even earlier cookery book that we didn't know we had. So we discovered today that we've probably got a cookery book from 1531, which again is Italian. And if anybody speaks Italian here, I'd be interested to know what it's mostly about. I think it's mostly recipes. It's on that table in there, and I'll show it to you. It's a tiny little book, but it's really interesting, and I'm quite excited we discovered that today, just because you were coming. So most of the cookery books that came with those donations were English cookery books. There were some French, some Italian, as you've seen, some German, but mostly English. These three came together from Robert Miller, I think. They're all published in 1671, and they're all tiny little books, and we've got them out there. Published after the restoration of Charles II, when they were sort of showing off how aristocratic food was, how posh the Queen was, that she could have chefs or cooks that could provide food of this quality. So they're on display here. And then we also got two copies of Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, and I'm sure you've heard of Hannah Glass, the bestseller of the 18th century, first published in 1747, sorry, gone too far, first published in 1747, and we have a number of copies here. It was first published in folio size, so it was quite big, reproduced by Prospect Books quite relatively recently. Hannah Glass is a very, very interesting cook who we'll come to a bit later. And then, because in the early 20th century, people realised that we had an interesting collection of cookery books, we started to attract various scholars, and this man, André Simon, researched at Guildhall Library, in the old library. He worked here, he wrote, I think it was 104 books in 60 years of writing. Lots of them about wine, as I'm sure you know. He helped set up the Wine Trade Club, and the Wine Trade Club library is now here as well. It belongs to another collection, but it's now here, which he helped set up. So he worked and researched here. And when he also founded the Wine and Food Society, now the International Wine and Food Society, and when he died, they inherited his library, added to his library, and then it was given to us. So 3,000 books, which we now call the André Simon collection, and it's really strong in 20th century and some 19th, but really strong in 20th century material. And what we did was, I just got together all of these Ambrose Heath books. Ambrose Heath, in case you don't know, was writing in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, but mostly in the 40s, he was producing little books like this, and most of them he called good something, so good sweets, good food, etc. We've got most of them out on show here. He was a very good writer. He's sort of forgotten now, which is a real shame. One of his books has been reprinted quite recently. Unfortunately, with the reprint, you don't get the Edward Borden covers, which are on these, which are very beautiful covers on some of these. And you have to pay a lot of money for these books, not because they're by Ambrose Heath, because the covers are by Edward Borden. So we've got loads and loads of them.
What was his name?
Edward Borden. Some people say Bowden, but I always say Borden. So he was worked with Eric Revilius, you may know, an illustrator. He was one of the most famous English illustrators of the 1930s to the 1960s, really. Lived in Essex. And then, by the 1970s, we were getting people coming to do research here, and one of those people was Elizabeth David. And she used to come to do her research. And by the 1970s, as you will know, she was researching books, not just recipe books, but books where she wanted to go into the whole background and history of a particular food. So she came here to do research into this, which in my opinion is her masterpiece and probably one of the top 10 cookery books ever written. She did lots of her research here. And she devoted so much time to her research that if you look at this book, you will notice there's not a recipe until page 256, which I think is a sign of a good book. That's the sort of book I want to buy. No recipes till page 256, and then you get loads of recipes. When she used to come, I was told this story by a colleague who's now retired. She used to come on a Saturday quite often. She would come in the morning and she would pass this pond, which is just outside in the corner by the church. She'd bring a string bag with a bottle of white wine in it, and she would lower the white wine into the pond. Then she'd go and do a couple of hours research, and she'd come out, take the wine out, and have her picnic, chilled. But I had to do a talk yesterday, and my former manager was sitting at the back, and she corrected me afterwards and said, it's not this pond, it's the pond further up the road. So I've got a pond, and it's a much more discreet pond, so Elizabeth David knew what she was doing. When she died in 1992, and before that very famous auction where people clamoured for everything that was in the house, including paying £300 for a jug full of wooden spoons, before that auction, we were invited to go to her house in West London and basically buy her library. So we bought 900 of her books. We didn't buy her antiquarian material because that had gone to her nephews or gone to other institutions. But we bought basically 900 of her books. When they came to Guildhall Library, we discovered that inside the books were hundreds of post-it notes, postcards, letters, unpublished articles that were just sitting in there because she never wrote on her books. Unlike Jane Grigson, whose books I've seen, she used to write on them. Elizabeth David never wrote on her books. But she'd write on little bits of paper and she'd stick them in where her comments were. Unfortunately, we had to take them all out of the books because we couldn't let the public see the books with little notes that might get lost, misplaced. So we took them all out. And as you can see, they're marked what page they've come from what particular book, and mounted on acid-free paper. And I shall come back to that. No, I'll come back to that now. Inside this book, which belonged to Elizabeth David, we found this, which is a review of that book, which is apparently unpublished, in which Elizabeth David attempts to be kind to Fanny Craddock. And she finds it really, really hard to be kind to Fanny Craddock, because not only is the book about the very antithesis of what Elizabeth David is all about, but she didn't like Fanny Craddock. Apparently she used to hide from her when she came into her shop. She'd hide under the stairs, apparently, until she'd gone away. But this is the article here, and this is one of the things that I came across, and I thought was really interesting. So when a journalist came in, whose name has just gone out of my head, and I shall tell you, and I'm sure you know who it is, it's the editor of Fire and Knife. Tim Hayward, thank you. And when he came in, and I took him down to the stores, and he said, well, what's really interesting? So I bought some things off the shelf I thought was interesting, and I showed him this. And I said, I've been meaning to write an article about this, but I'm too lazy. Do you want to write an article about this? So he wrote an article, and it appears in here. It's the very first issue of Fire and Knives, and it's the first article in the first issue, which came from spotting that. So that's just one example of just one tiny thing in our 10,000 books that you can take away and write an article, hopefully get paid by the Observer, food policy, for printing it. The article and the book that she tried to read is out there, and it's on the bottom table, so do read it. She really attempts to be kind. You can see she keeps changing her mind. So far as we know, it was never published. If anybody comes across the published review, I'd be interested in knowing where it turned up. At one point she says they carry a good idea almost to the point of dementia. Right, so I put this up because this is one of my favourite prints, and it's to say what's the use of cookery books? And this is what people thought might be the use of cookery books in about the 1820s. And in fact, what's happening is that the cook is actually neglecting Hannah Glass's art of cookery, which is there. See, the glasses cookery, which is on the shelf, and cobwebs have grown across it because she hasn't been doing anything she should be doing because she's reading Walter Scott novels. And in reading Walter Scott novels, she's committed the greatest sin that a cook could commit when they cooked on an open fire. She's let ashes fall into her dripping pan, which means then you can't use it. You can't use it to baste the food. And she's let the dog run off with the joint and the cat with the fish. So I just like this image. So I just wanted to show it to you. Also, it's a wonderful example of the social. It's the parrot saying, "Cook, cook, fire, fire, thieves, thieves." And you can just see this book. The green book says "Heart of Midlothian," so it's Walter Scott novel. I just want to talk about a few people. Last time we had the visit here, I was talking about Agnes Marshall, and it turned out that Robin Weir was in the audience. And Robin Weir is the world expert on Agnes Marshall, so I was really embarrassed afterwards. But I checked he wasn't coming today. So if you don't know who Agnes Marshall is, she was the Queen of Victorian ice cream, and Robin Weir was on television yesterday talking about her, which was an amazing coincidence. This is her, a rather beautiful woman, who sadly didn't live very. She lived to just about 40, I think. But she ran a cooking school in West London, round Welbeck Street. And we have all of her books here, and we have some of the journals that she set at the table, it was called. This is the cooking school. This is taken from some of the books we have here. And the idea of the cooking school was that the lady of the house would bring along her cook. So these are the ladies of the household standing behind, watching their cook learn things going, how to make basically ice creams, which was Mrs. Marshall's speciality. So this is one of her, Mrs. Marshall's patented ice boxes, and it functioned by you packing salt and ice around the outside of the encased sort of shells in the middle. She also patented this, which was her ice cream maker, and if you look at it carefully you can see it's no different really to an electric one we have today with a big paddle, except you had to turn the handle yourself, and round here you packed the salt and the ice around the edges. Robin Weir owns one of these, and he says it freezes ice cream much better than any modern one. And it freezes it much more quickly because there's so much more surface area in contact with the ingredients. If you want to buy one, they cost a fortune because there's only a couple in the world. She also sold lots of moulds, lots of ice cream moulds and cake moulds. So these are all from her books. And this is her most beautiful book, with fancy ices. And it has a nice polar bear serving ices on the front. And these are illustrations from, not from Fancy Ices, but from the ice cream I think it's from. Yes. So this is an ice cream made from, looking like that one, and the person who made that ice cream was Ivan Day, I'm sure you've heard of, who is a complete and utter genius. And he specialises in making historical food, and he made this one. And this is another one that Ivan Day made of freezing. It's not asparagus flavoured, but it looks like asparagus in a pewter or mould. And then you do multiple ones and tie it up like that. And then if you're lucky enough to go to the Fat Hut, I don't know if he still does it, but one of the desserts is this, which is Mrs. Marshall's cornet, which is taken from Mrs. Marshall, and Heston Blumenthal does this one. And it's delicious, I have that one. So some other ideas for how you could use our collections. You could look at a bill of fare or a menu for a particular day, and they specialised this in the 18th and 19th centuries, that books, I keep jumping, books would print a menu for every single day of the year. And so this is one from the early 19th century. And then this is ideas about how people ate their food. So, as I'm sure you know, in the early part of the 19th century, they were still laying out food. So you would have a first course where they brought all the food to you for the first course and mixed up dishes. So you get some savoury, some sweet. You get your fish and the meat sometimes at the same time. Then they clear the whole thing away and bring in the second course, which might have a roast chicken and an apple pie and something like that. A bit like a buffet, being laid on the table repeatedly. So that was the French style, and then the Russian style came in later, which is the style that we use today, where they come and serve you a first course, second course, which is where the food is sort of limited to either savoury or sweet. And then ways of laying out tables, so we have lots of diagrams of ways of laying out tables. See, these ones are themed around particular months. And then we have quite a lot of books where the book emanates from a famous, I think there's a timer on this which is making me do this, emanates from a famous chef or somebody who's running one of a famous pub. This is from Duncan MacDonald, who was head cook at the Bedford Tavern and Hotel in Covent Garden. So there are lots of celebrity sort of cookbooks from this period, mostly by people who are either working for aristocracy or running famous pubs and taverns. This is another one, the New London Family Cook, again with menus themed around particular months. And then this one, I hope it's not going to jump forward. This is another one where I think it was Tim Hayward again, where he came back another time and he said, "Got any more good ideas?" So I showed him this, and this looks very unpromising, but it is. You can just about see what it says on there. It says the Isobar, and if you don't know what the Isobar was, it was a bar and restaurant that was run in the basement of this building, the Lawn Road Flats, the Isobar building, and it was built in the 1930s, a very radical and rather beautiful building. And the idea was that the kitchens were so small that they expected the residents to either dine out or to dine in the basement, where there was a restaurant in the basement. So it was communal dining, and they set up a club in the basement, and residents would take in turns to host a meal. And they produced this little, it's not a menu, but it's a wine list, or a drinks list. And one of the people who lived in that building was Raymond Postgate, who founded the Good Food Guide. Agatha Christie lived there briefly. And one of the people who did the cooking in the basement was that man, who I'm sure some of you will recognise. Yes, that's right, Philip Harbin. And he did some of the cooking in the Isobar. But if you just go, I think, is it the next one? They go back. What's really interesting is that in the introduction to this, it talks about things like here, the pepper in the mills is Teller cherry black, and the bread is made to the Isobar recipe from stone ground flour. The coffee is blended to an Isobar formula and made in individual Melia coffee pots. Deli rice, 8 years old and hill grown, is always served. So basically they're sourcing food, you know, they want specific food. This is 1939, I think it is. So we think that we're interested. They were making risotto before they were making risotto in London in the 1930s. So they have virgin olive oil. So all those things that you think came in with Elizabeth David in 1950 when she published Italian cooking book happened much earlier. You know, these people were champagne socialists. And Raymond Postgate, who was the father of Oliver Postgate. Raymond Postgate was a communist, but he enjoyed food like this, and he really was a champagne socialist. Right. Yeah, Philip Harbin went on to become one of the first TV chefs, along with Marguerite Patton, and I just about remember him from the late 1960s. He was always like my idea of what a chef should look like. He was rather jolly and slightly overweight, but really, really nice character. And we have lots of books by him. He wrote an enormous amount of books, and we have lots of the titles here. Just briefly, something else about Hannah Glasse. So the intention of Hannah Glasse's book was that the lady of the household, again, should be giving the book to her cook. And that's because this is the time when the middle classes are emerging, and people are moving to London, so moving to big cities, they're becoming more urbanised. They won't necessarily know how to run a household, so these are instruction manuals on how to run a household. And what Hannah Glasse was doing was she was simplifying French food and simplifying instructions, so people like these newly middle class ladies of the household would understand the instructions and understand the language, because before this they were using very French language in English cooking books, which lots of people didn't understand how to produce the meals. This is one I came across that I rather like. This is To Stew Pears Purple from her book. And the way she gets the pears to turn purple is to cover them with a pewter plate while she's cooking them. And the reason they turn purple is because there's a chemical reaction, which is a poisonous chemical reaction. So if you cook them long enough, they would be deadly. We obviously didn't realise this, but if you cook them long enough to turn them purple, they would be poisonous. I've tried to make this dish because I've got a pewter plate, and I could never get them to turn purple, so perhaps there was not enough lead in the pewter that I was using. Unfortunately, she basically went bankrupt and she had to sell the copyright to her book. And she tried again with this one, and again she went bankrupt and disappeared from history. Nobody knows what happened to her. She had a number of children who ended up all over the world, but nobody knows exactly what happened to Hannah Glass. Now, Florence White is a sort of a hero of mine. I'm sure you've heard of Florence White. She lived in this period. She's one of the first women to earn a living, just about earn a living, as a food journalist, food writer. She also had about 38 other jobs, if not more than that, being a nurse and a companion and travelling and just setting up a cookery school, just all sorts of things. She died in virtual poverty at the end of her life, but she wrote what I think, and what other people think, is one of the most important books of the 20th century. That's Good Things in England. And she also set up the English Folk Cookery Association, which very sadly, as far as I can tell, died with her. I can't find anything happening with the English Folk Cookery Association or any archives after she died in 1940. I've tried the Folklore Society, I've tried lots of people, nobody seems to know what happened to it. But what she was interested in, she was interested in English food, which in the 1930s wasn't fashionable. People weren't interested in English food, they were interested in Frenchified food. And so she started to collect English recipes, and she advertised in articles she wrote for people to send in recipes to her from all over the country. So, and she recorded where they were from, and this is an example of them. So sometimes they're contemporary recipes, sometimes the one from Staffordshire beef steaks is from 1823. And she was pioneering really, because she travelled all over the place and she collected this material. This is the one for Shrewsbury cakes, or Shrewsbury cakes, depending which side of the river you're from. And that's the one that's on your bookmark that we've handed out now. And somebody came the other day who'd taken the bookmark and taken it to a chef who'd made these and said they were the best Shrewsbury cakes they'd ever eaten. And where did I get the recipe from? This is where I got it from. But as you can see, it's from a cookery book, a recipe book from 1630 to 1750. So Shrewsbury cakes date right from medieval times to today, so they've been continuously made for hundreds and hundreds of years. Unfortunately, when my colleague made that recipe, she said there's too much fat and she couldn't get them to roll out. So have a go and see what you think, but they are delicious if you can get them to it. This is another of the books she wrote that people don't really know about, Flowers as Food, which I don't think we've got it on the show today. It's quite hard to come by now, but it's a very interesting book. Typical young suckers. And she's taken some of the recipes you can see from Hannah Glass, so she did her research as well. She also produced a series of these little books, which are even harder to find. I found this one on eBay, on all sorts of subjects. She earned a living doing needlework, etc. And she used to write these little books just to earn a living. She wrote one for the Singer sewing machine as well. There's a list of some of the ones she produced just on the back of that. Right, I've been asked to just briefly talk about how I did the research for my own book, which was published this year. So this is called The Curious Cookbook, and its subtitle, which I can never remember even though I wrote it, is Viper Soup, Badger Ham, Stewed Sparrows and 100 More Historic Recipes. So, how did I research a book on that subject? Well, basically, what I did is I looked at every cookery book from 1390 to 1800, basically. That's how I did it. And you might think, well, that's a huge task, but it's not such a huge task here, or the British Library, because the access to them is quite easy here, and it's not too bad at the British Library. And also, there's not that many, up to 1700, there's not that many. There's only about 100 from, no less than that, about 50 from the 16th century. But when you go back before printing, you will find that recipes are in manuscripts, and this is a recipe that dates from the 1390s, and it's actually in English. It says, take fair garbage, chickens' heads, feet, livers, etc. And it's instruction how to make garbage. Garbage is, it's sort of the bits that we would now regard as the bits you might throw away, and in the past, garbage meant the bits that you kept, which is slightly odd. So it's the sort of bits like the neck and the liver and things which you can turn into something rather than the meat itself. This is a recipe that I might just read to you, which I quite like. This is one I want to listen to read to you actually. This one here, this is a recipe of something called lozenges, and I'll just read you the translated version, because it was written in English, but the English is a bit strange, Middle English. But this is the modern interpretation. So, lozenges. Take good broth and put it in an earthenware pot. Take the best quality white flour and make a paste with water and make thin sheets with a rolling pin. Dry it until hard and boil it in the broth. Take raw cheese grated and lay it in the dish with sugar and spice powder. Lay the lozenges as whole as you can. Above that, more powder and more cheese, and so twice or thrice, and serve. So if you think about it, what they're making is pasta. They're making lasagna. The only thing that's odd is they're putting sugar in it with the spices. So 1390, the English were making lasagna in this country, and I like to tell that to Italian people. That's from a form of curry, or form of curry, which is a very famous cookery book, manuscript from that period, 1390. And then this one is how to make a cockatrice, or a cocking-treece. And you take a capon and scald him and draw him, that's take his innards out, and cut him in two around the waist. Take a pig and scald him and draw him in the same manner, and cut him also about the waist. Take a needle and thread and sew the forepart of the capon to the hind part of the pig, and the forepart of the pig to the hind part of the capon, and then stuff them as you would stuff a pig. Put them on spit and roast them. When they're done enough, gild them with yolks and eggs, powdered ginger and saffron, then pour over the juice of parsley and then serve it at a royal feast. So it's almost what they're doing in this picture, which is just the picture researcher found, which was fantastic. So they're making what's called a conceit, which was a recipe that's meant to cause surprise to people when you brought it out. And this is one from medieval times. Conceits were produced right up into the 19th century, and that's exactly what Hessen Blumenthal does now. He does conceits when he's doing his entertaining foods. I came across a recipe for stewed sparrows, which was just a recipe really for cooking small birds, which they do in Italy still today. But what was interesting that I also came across a reference in an archaeology report for London Dig of digging when they dug up sparrow pots. And this is in America, where they put sparrow pots on houses. In America, they put them on like we do bird boxes. In the 17th century, and in possibly in medieval times in London, they put them on the houses just like that, because they found earthenware sparrow pots. But what they did was that they would take them down, and there was a bigger hole at the back. You could reach in and take the young out to cook. Or you could take the eggs out. But basically, it wasn't a sort of bird box. It was for something to provide food. Most interestingly, it's found on, when they do archaeological digs, it's found on the more aristocratic houses, not on the poor people's houses. So it wasn't something that people turned to when they were desperate for protein. It was a sort of speciality. I put this up. My colleague dared me to put this picture up here, because there is a recipe in this book for cooking otter, barbecued otter. And it's the only recipe I can find in English, and actually it's actually published in an English cookery book, but it comes from a French cookery book originally. So they were barbecuing otter, certainly in the 17th century. And then I came across this picture, quite a famous picture by Schneider's, Flemish artist. And if you see down here, there is an otter. So although I can find no other recipe for otter in English cookery, there is certainly one being sold in Flanders at a fishmonger's. There's also a very live seal there, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. Maybe some artistic license. There's just a close-up. Then this is probably one of the most famous cookery books of the 17th century that I looked at. This is May's The Accomplished Cook. This is a copy from 1671 that was actually produced earlier. And one of his most famous recipes is this one, which is the one from where you make a pie, and this is another conceit, you bring it to the table when they cut the pie, the frogs and toads jump out. I was involved with one of those programmes with Sue Perkins and Giles Corran, and I was at the table when this was brought to them, and everyone else at the table was told what was going to happen, but Sue Perkins and Giles Corran weren't told what was going to happen. So Sue Perkins took the lid off, and the person who ran away from the table was Giles Corran. He squealed and ran away because he couldn't bear to see these. And Sue Perkins had to catch them and put them back in there because we were worried because the plates around them were quite hot. We were worried they were going to get scalded. But it's one of the things that in the 17th century, it's one of those conceits they specialised in upper class houses. This is not the food that everyone was eating. This is sort of special food.
Did they actually eat them?
No.
No, it was
No,
just...
it was meant to break the ice at parties, basically.
Oh, right.
It's like 4 on 20 blackbirds baked in the
Yeah.
it's exactly that. I came across a recipe, which I don't think I've marked in here, for making a cowslip tart. And the instructions were, take a gallon of cowslip flowers. Well, I think cowslips are a protected species now, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a gallon's worth of them. But it just shows you how imaginative food was in the 17th century, that they were producing things like that. And it's the sort of thing that Hessenlind or somebody like that will produce now. I came across one recipe for cooking badger. That was how to make badger ham. And again, it was probably a foreign origin, but it was in the English cookery book. And I thought it might come in useful when we do some culling later this year. A colleague of mine has promised that when he comes across that next day badger, he's going to make badger ham and we can try it. I can't imagine what it would taste like. One of the people that I read was Elizabeth Raffald, who was slightly later than Hannah Glass. And she specialised in things like this. This is, again, Ivan Day. This is egg and bacon made from flummery, so made from virtually blancmange and jelly. And she has lots and lots of recipes of these wacky ideas for producing these joke things. These were edible, and they were flavoured with different flavours. And Ivan Day made those out of flummery. And flummery is a really delicate thing to work with. And how he did that, I've just no idea. That's why I think he's a genius. And he made those as well, flummery fish, gilded. And if anybody's tried to gild food, which I have, you get the sheet of gold, then it's in your hair, it's floating away, it's sticking all over your hands. So to get it onto some flummery in the dish is just amazing.
Sorry, could you explain flummery?
Flummery, it changes, the nature of flummery changes. It's a bit like blancmange, but it's half a glass blancmange, it's got sort of ground almonds. And it's a bit like original blancmange, but it changes over time. So sometimes the ingredients might include almonds, ground almonds, they might just include cream, etc. But it's most closely associated with a blancmange. There are lots of recipes in the 19th century for cod's head and shoulders, or just cod's head, which I found really interesting because if you try to make, this is a meal for 2 or 4, if you try to make a meal out of cod's head now, you wouldn't feed one person because most cod are tiny. But clearly in the 19th century, cods were still enormous. And this is a really nice picture that we've got in our collection of a fishmonger's. And it shows you the size of the fish that they were selling. Probably the biggest ones there are probably salmon. But certainly these, I'm not an expert on fish, whether that's a turbot or a halibut. But what's also interesting about this is that somebody did tell me that this looks like portioning up the fish. Might not necessarily be that. It might be what's called scotching, which stops the fish was so fresh that you did that to stop them curling up. So that's not necessarily portioning up the fish. And also, you often see flatfish in the 19th century. Those ones that look like they're sort of turning up were actually tied. So they were tied in that shape. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but anyway, somebody who's a fishmonger might know why they tied the flatfish into that curved shape. And then this recipe I came across, which I rather enjoyed. This was in the 19th century book, which it was how to make toasted water. And it comes from Mrs. Beaton. Take a slice of bread, 1 quart of boiling water, cut a slice from a stale loaf, toast it off a nice brown on every side. How many sides? Every side. But do not allow it to burn or blacken. Put it in a jug, pour the boiling water over it, cover it closely and let it remain until cold. And when it's strained, it's ready for use. But the most interesting thing is, you don't eat the bread, you drink the water, you throw the bread away, which I think is really extraordinary. And it was basically for invalids. So what nourishment you got out of the water that's just had toast soaking in it, I've no idea. But she does say that you must be careful that you drink it when it's cold and not warm, because it will be disgusting if it's warm. This is famous from Mrs. Beaton. This is when, after Mrs. Beaton had died, she died at 29 and Ward bought the rights to her book, they kept adding recipes and adding recipes. So it grew and grew and grew. They pretended she was still alive right into the 1950s, I think, when she was 140. But they used to introduce recipes just because they wanted to be comprehensive. So these are some recipes for cooking kangaroos. And there's one for cooking parrot pie, which again I'll just like to read to you, which I quite like. If I can find it. Parakeet pie it is actually. Ingredients: 1 dozen parakeets, a few slices of cooked beef, 4 rashers of bacon, 3 hard-boiled eggs, minced parsley, lemon peel, pepper, salt, etc. So you basically pack it all in the pie and you cook it. But Alan Davidson, who had actually eaten parrot and cockatoo, said that he came across this recipe for cooking a cockatoo. It says, cook a cockatoo with an old boot in plenty of boiling water until the boot is tender, then throw away the bird and eat the boot. So that's what Alan Davidson thought of that, and it's probably just included in this as being just to be comprehensive, not because they thought anybody was going to eat it. But in Australia now people are eating kangaroo again because it's a pest and it's apparently very, very nice to eat. This was another thing I came across which I really thought was interesting. This was written in the 1920s. It's in a book called The Whole Art of Dining, 1921. And it's talking about a working class tea. And it's talking about a working class that had just been slaughtered on the fields of Flanders. And this is the attitude they had to them. The tea of the English working classes is the most eccentric of meals and one of the greatest injuries a gourmet could possibly conceive. For with the tea they partake of various kinds of salted meat and dried fish, such as corned beef, kippers, bloaters, red herrings, winkles, shrimps, pickles, watercresses, cucumber, lettuce, jam or marmalade, bread and butter, and cake. This incongruous kind of food may no doubt be quite nice and tasty for this class of people, but it must shock anyone endowed with refined Epicurean instinct. So that's the sort of attitude of somebody who wrote a book. The Whole Art of Dining is an instruction manual for the Nouveau Riche, basically, how to behave in society and how to look down on the working classes. So that was another interesting one I came across. And then I finished with recipes from the Second World War, because it was hard to find curious recipes that we would think odd now, because we eat so many different foods that were written in the 1960s. If just mentioning foods that might have gone into Indian or Chinese food might have been amazing to somebody living in the 1960s, but now it would not be something they'd eat every day. So I had to stop at the Second World War, and this was a recipe for rook pie. And if anybody's eaten rook pie, you have to take the spine of the rook out, because otherwise it will be bitter. I've never eaten rook pie, and I don't ever want to take the spine. But I came across this little book, which was called A Kitchen Goes to War. Famous people contribute 150 recipes to a ration time cookery book. So celebrity, that's what they do today. Magazines always contact the celebrities saying, send us your favourite recipe. They did it in the war to sort of cheer people up. And this is possibly my favourite recipe of all time. It comes from this man, Jack Warner, who was Dixon of Dock Green. And it's very complicated, so you have to listen really carefully. He says, the ingredients are 1 dozen water biscuits, 2 ounces of margarine or butter, 2 tablespoons of chutney, about a quarter pound of cheese. Method, this is the really hard bit. Spread the biscuits with margarine or butter, cover with cheese in slices and chutney. That's it. And at least he wasn't as foolish as this man, who I'm sure you recognise as Kenneth Clark, who sent in this recipe in the war. It was being rationed. His recipe was, it's the Kenneth Clark's ham roll salad. 4 slices of boneless cooked ham. Who's going to get that in rationing anyway? 1 jar of pâté de foie paste, French mustard, 1 lettuce, 1 bunch of watercress. Spread the pâté on the cooked ham, and then a little French mustard, roll up like a Swiss roll, dish on a bed of lettuce, and garnish with sprigs of watercress. So it just shows you how out of touch he was, just like his son was as well. That's my book. It's not an advert for my book, but you can buy it today if you're interested. And just to say, what's the future of our collections? Well, as I'm sure you know, we have the Guild of Food Writers Library here, which is growing. This is not the Guild of Food Writers Library. So we've just had a donation from a famous potter called Mary Von Rausch, you may have heard of, who's also a food writer. And then about 6 weeks ago, Lula Grimes, who is a member of your guild, phoned me up and she said, we've got loads of review copies in Olive and Good Food offices. Do you want them? And I said, well, do you know what you've got? She said, no, you just have a lot. So she sent a lot, so that we've now got to go through them because we don't keep duplicates. And I've also got to go through them thinking, for the future, is this going to be a valuable book for us to keep? So in 100 years' time, somebody will thank me. Because I don't want 20 books on how to barbecue, something like that. So sometime I've got to go through all these and work out what's valuable for keeping. But I want to keep something that's typical of the time, something that's important, maybe something that's a very beautiful book. So that's the end of what I'm going to say now. Right, and so what we can do is we can go into the other room and I can just briefly introduce you to the books there, and then just feel free. You can handle everything really, but just be careful. A few of them have very loose covers to them, or boards. And the catalogue, in case you want to look at it, is on those computers at the back. Best to do keyword search or author searches. If you want to search in other ways, you can ask me or my colleague Val, who's sitting at the back there. And so if you want to just leave your stuff here, so we're perfectly safe, we just go into the other room.
Really? You brought it from here?
No, it's not. It's getting stored, but it's all retrievable in the batch. So that's why you can't see. Just have your attention for a moment, please. People keep asking me how to use the library. I forgot to tell you how to use the library. We are a public reference library. We're open to absolutely everybody. We don't have membership. You can just come in off the street and you can see 99.9% of what we've got. If it's a rare item like most of the things on that table, we need some proof of address. That's all we need. Most of our books are kept in storage, so the stuff you see here is just about 10% of what we've got. And we can retrieve it from storage within 15 minutes, and actually the average delivery time is 7 minutes. So you can search our catalogue from anywhere in the world. Just go to the City of London website and you'll find us there. I forgot to tell you how to do that.
This huge library doesn't tell the whole thing. But I found amazing examples of Elizabeth David's writing for the Journal of Wine and Food Society is basically
tinned foods and how to use them.
so that's quite bad. Been published anywhere else. That's quite bad.
Who's written this? It's just advertisements. Yeah. Already formed book, you see. 8 to 1. Student. Oh, obstacle.